Now let's plan projects with AI using an AI automation inside of Make.com. And this is video number 3 of a 6-part series where I'm showing you how to build an entire project management system yourself using tools like Airtable and adding in AI components that some of the biggest project planning tools don't even have using Make.com. And if you haven't seen the other videos yet, I recommend going back to the start, watching it right through, because this is going to continue on. And we're going to talk about now how to actually build out this first automation here that you can see in Make.com. It's actually quite a simple one, but there's a few understandings that we need to gather first about the database structuring before we can actually get to this automation component. So we trigger most of our automations via a webhook. So if we come back to the flow of this particular project management system, then we can see that when we add our project ideas, they get added into a database. That database is the projects database. And then from there, we don't want to move it into a different database. We actually want to keep it in the same table inside of Airtable and trigger that information to then move it into a different table within that database. So that's basically what we're going to go over now. So here in this projects table, we've actually got all the information added in for the description of the idea that we're going to work on. We've got the hypothesis and we've got the extra task context. So here we now want to be able to trigger that AI automation some way. So we simply trigger it by a webhook, and then we can add in a button that triggers this automation. So let's have a look at that first and foremost. So the button has a formula attached to it that says, if AI model, if prompt templates, and if prompt template project plan, if there is something in those fields, then concatenate, which means basically join together the webhook. And so this webhook actually comes from Make.com. So that's how it gets triggered. We send it in via this webhook, but we send it in with some extra information like the Airtable base ID, project table ID, the distributed task table ID, team members table ID. So we can gather up all the information that we need and send it all into the automation at one time. So this is a little hack that we found after we've been building for 18 months now inside of Airtable and Make.com. What most people do inside of Make.com when they're building with Airtable is if they want to get a record, then they'll use the get a record module. If they want to create a new record, then they'll use a create a new record. But the issue with that is, let's say you're building this for clients. If you were to use those modules, then you would have to remap those fields every single time. So instead of the installation of this automation taking a couple of minutes, which happens when you install one of our templates, it literally takes, this automation would take you 30 seconds to set up. Then what you would have to do is remap every field. So if we have a look at, this end field here, actually that's not a good example because there's just 2 fields to map, but there's some of them. This one would actually be quite easy because there's not a lot to map. But some of them, we have like a dozen, maybe 24 fields that need to be remapped into Airtable. So if you were to do that manually, firstly, the system is so slow, so it will take you forever, but it'll probably take you like 30 minutes to set up this one automation. Whereas what we use are the API call modules, and then we just simply use JSON in order to update the fields. So that's why it becomes so important to actually use and create. So that's really tip number 1, is understanding that we can build much faster if we're using API calls and adding a little bit of JSON scripts into the actual system themselves. Now if you don't know JSON, I didn't know JSON when we got started, we can learn it very quickly and easily, but ChatGPT can do a lot of the work. I'm going to talk about more of that in a second. But if we come back into here, then we have our formula set up with our webhook. So that's going to trigger the information into Make.com from Airtable. So then we simply just have a webhook response, which closes the window. So if we trigger, let's just unlink this and let's just go run once. So if we trigger this, it opens up a new window. And then if we add that response, then it closes the window automatically. So you can see now, if we open up this, we've got our base ID, our table ID, our distributed task table ID, our record ID, and our team members table ID that is all sent in now via the webhook. So that allows us to then send information back to any of these other tables within the database as well, because we now have the ID. So we can send it into any table very easily and effectively. So when we're setting up this base for the first time, then we actually put these into our brand assets tab. So if we come across in the brand assets tab, we can see these different fields here. So this app ID will match the app ID that's in the URL string of the Airtable. So that app ID is going to be for the entire app, like the entire base here. But then we have different IDs for our different projects tables. So if I click across into AI models, it has a different ID. If I click into project pillars, it has a different ID. So we grab that from the URL string in the second part of the URL after the / there with that starts with TBL, and we add all of those in. So we can send all of that information in the very one webhook. So we can send information back into Airtable very easily, no matter what we want to do. We capture that webhook so the window closes automatically. We just have this script here that says window.close, and then we click save. Then we want to get that information from Airtable. So we use a method get, and we don't need to add anything else in besides getting that information. So if I unlink now and I run that automation again, if we open up this bubble here, we can see that if we go to body and then fields, we can see now it's pushed in all of these fields from the actual table, from the database into make.com. So now we can reference all of these fields inside of our automation and our prompting so that we can begin to build out the rest of the workflow. So all of these things are in here. So what we actually do when we're building out is like, we've got to figure out what is all the information we need inside of this workflow. Like, what are all the things we need the AI to know and understand so we can feed those fields in. If we come back in now, once we have all of those built out, we actually set them in variables. So we add them into the variables field here. Like, okay, looks like there might be a bit of an error, which is pretty interesting. So let's just remap that task ID to make sure everything's going to work correctly. Cool. So we just remapped that just in case there was a glitch. But basically what we've got here is we set all of our variables. Now, when I first started building, we never really set variables up front. And it's okay for small automations just like this, because not a lot really, there's not too much that's going to change. And if it does change, then it's actually really easy to remap the rest of these workflows. But we have some more advanced automations that have multiple different routes. They might have hundreds of different modules, and you use the variables or the fields inside of Airtable multiple times. So if you were to ever have to update that field, like maybe you make an update in the system or something changes, then you'd have to go through and remap everything in the entire system again, or like at least that field again. Whereas if you set all your variables up front, if you ever need to change that field for some reason, like I did just now, then you only need to update it here. And then you use those variables in all of the future prompts. So that's the benefit of like using this for one extra operation. It's totally worth it. It makes all of the extra building and error fixing and stuff and debugging so much easier later on. So we set those variables, and then we like to give the users a bit of an understanding of what's happening. So we set our AI status to AI writing here in this module. So that will then show inside of the dashboard that the AI is actually doing something. Because if you don't set this status, then no one really knows if it's working or not, and if it's actually executing. It's very hard to determine. So we just simply update that field, and it makes it so much easier. It's a much better user experience. Then we get into our AI modules now. So we use OpenRouter, and OpenRouter is a great tool to be able to, it's like an aggregator. It pulls in all of the different AI models so that when you're developing, you can choose any model that you like in your workflows. And we've talked about that in the database structuring, and I think we talked about it in video 1 and 2. So you can go back and review those of how we've built that into the system. But we have our OpenRouter module that then we can begin to map in, or like we can begin to prompt. So the way that we structure this is pretty much every prompt that we send in has context, which is about the brand, task idea, description, hypothesis, context, the impact score. Then we have our project prompt structure, like the prompt itself. So remember that prompt was built inside of Airtable to give the user the ability to change that prompt whenever they want. The big difference I see in those building really great systems, AI automation systems, versus those just building simple AI automations with no real thought to the end product, is that most people are putting most of the prompt or all of the prompt inside of make.com or NAN. It has its place and time in order to do that, but to build really great systems that customers love, that clients love, that make it so much more user-friendly that makes it very easy to update. You want to give as much control over the prompting inside of the table, inside of the database, inside of the tool that they're operating it from. You don't want to be giving all of the prompts inside of the automation tool itself. It's not what they're designed for, but most people get it wrong. So once we have the main prompt inside here, we add in a little bit more of like I'll call this our system prompts, like the back end stuff that people don't really need to see, which is basically just saying like, here's how we want to get the output. We don't want any extra context, times and dates and so forth. Then if we come down a little bit further, we have our AI model mapped in here. So that's because we're linking this AI models table into here. So if I scroll across, we should be able to find this here somewhere. So we have our AI model table from over here linked into this record so that we can choose, if we click this plus button, we can choose any of these models here. And then we have the AI model plain text. So this is the text that we send into and map into the automation. So by mapping in this text exactly as that is into this AI model field here, then that's how the correct model gets chosen for this workflow. And this is how we can switch models so easily depending on what we want to do, depending on if a new model comes out. We have a few extra settings here as well, which is enable automatic fallbacks. That means if that model is overloaded, it will fall back to a different model. We have our max tokens. We have our temperature here, and we typically leave the rest of the settings as is. The one big difference though, when we are using these API calls versus if we were to just add in an Airtable module like create a record. So now we have to send, once this AI output has been generated, we need to send this back into Airtable. Now, what most people do is we go, okay, create a record inside of Airtable. And again, if you were to do that, you would have to remap the entire thing every single time you imported this blueprint into another account. So it just doesn't make any sense if you're building for clients, if you're selling templates, any of that type of stuff. It doesn't make any sense because you're basically giving yourself 10 times more work than what you need to. So we actually send that back in via JSON here in an API call. And remember, we got all of that. We sent all of our base ID, table ID, and record ID in the webhook. So we just need to match that into the right table. And we use a patch response so that updates the existing record. So we have get is getting the information out of Airtable. Post is posting into a new table and creating a new record. And patch is then updating an existing record. So we're updating this existing record with AI complete, but we're also updating the AI output project planned with a JSON string. So that's the one big difference that you need, is that we need to turn it into JSON before we send it back into Airtable. Now, sometimes we can do it inside of here. So if we go enable JSON mode, sometimes it will actually create the right formatting that we can send directly into Airtable without this module. But we found that it was a little bit temperamental. So we found that just adding the JSON module in here made it so much more consistent to then send it back into Airtable itself. Now that might improve over time. This module here is continually being updated and improved over the amount of, the last 12 to 18 months that we've been using it. So that's basically how this automation works. Now, if you do buy our Project Command 2.0 template that is on the website, then we'll give you this automation. We'll give you the Airtable template. We'll give you the other automations as well, plus all the education. So you can do that. It's a very small one-time fee. You'll be able to then take this template, use it yourself, but then install it into client businesses at 10 to 20x the price that you pay from us. But all of that will be available inside of the community as well. You also, if you buy any product from us, you get free access to our AI automation community where everyone gets to collaborate and learn together. But that's basically how it works, right? And we just continue to run that over and over again for every system. And that then allows us to create our first draft in the AI output field in this type of workflow. So that's automation number one. And we have two more automations. So we now have a final project plan that takes the first step. And then we have the distribution automation that automatically distributes tasks. So I'm going to talk about those in the next video. So remember, this is a 6-part series where you get to not only learn about the tool itself and how the tool works, but how we actually built it. So this is, I believe, number 3. If you want to move on to the next video where we talk about the next automation, make sure you subscribe, and then I'll see you in that video.